I'm going to take a minute to review complex numbers. Remember in the past, we've had this equation say x squared plus 1 equals 0. And when we try and solve this equation, we get x squared equals -1. And what we say is there is no real solution. There are no real numbers such that when you square it or you multiply the number times itself, you get a negative result. But what we say now is let's imagine there is an answer. So let's take the square root of both sides. So x would then equal the square root of -1. And let's imagine that this is true. So we're going to call that an imaginary number. So therefore, and we're going to call it the number I. So I is the square root of -1. And now, if we were to square both sides here, we see that I squared equals square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is -1. And that's what we use in problem solving. So, and the funny thing is as you move on in math and science, you'll find that these imaginary numbers are, in fact, existing numbers, and they will show up in problems and make sense in certain situations. So the biggest thing is we define the imaginary number I to be the square root of -1, and we note the result of that is if I square the number, then the square of I is a -1. Right? So we now have these things we call complex numbers. So complex numbers are always in the form of A plus BI. So it's the real part plus the imaginary part. Some examples are 1 plus 2i, 3 minus 2i, the square root of 2 plus i. Square root of 2 is irrational, but it's real. So it's real plus imaginary, and we can really get crazy like 1 plus root 3i. So you got the real part and the imaginary part. And how do you deal with these things? Well, when we add, subtract, multiply, or add and subtract, we add the real parts, we add the imaginary parts. So add. If I'm given the problem 7 minus 3i plus 4 plus 5i, what I think in my head is I add the real parts, 7 plus 4, and I add the imaginary parts, 3 plus 5, and those are both I. So the result here is going to be 11 plus 2i. All right, really quick. Subtract, same kind of thing. We've got, let's say we got 2 minus I minus 8 plus 3i. I would go ahead and carry that minus sign through. So you got 2 minus I minus 8 minus 3i. All right, I got a 2 and a -8. That's the real part. And the imaginary parts are -I and a -3i. So 2 minus 8 is -6 plus -I and -3i is a -4i. Done.